Aloha social scientists. This lecture is going to be talking and explaining a little bit more about what is the philosophy of social science. Here is the outline for this lecture. I'm going to be primarily explaining what the philosophy of science means, reviewing some of the central frameworks, and introducing the key term epistemology. All right, so the philosophy of social science is essentially the study of the methods and foundations of the social sciences. So, as opposed to Western philosophy that was briefly reviewed in the previous lecture, philosophers of social science are interested in examining the logic, the methods, theories, and concepts which we can consider the foundations of each of the social sciences, such as psychology, economics, political science, sociology, and anthropology. So, some of the things that philosophers of social science are interested in would be the degree to which the social sciences are similar and or different from the natural sciences, right? So an example would be thinking about the extent to which psychology is similar or different to biology, right? So you're probably thinking, of course they're different, and that's correct, right? But one of the things that philosophers of social science are interested in is how and why do those differences matter when we think about practicing systematic and objective research practices. So, another thing that philosophers of social science are paying attention to are examining causal relationships throughout society, right? So, thinking about correlations that come up, right? What's the extent to which crime is related to immigration, if any, right? So this is something that is getting a lot of coverage in the news right now, um, and trying to determine is there a causal relationship? Are there other factors influencing those patterns throughout society? And how might we go about studying um, that data, those trends and those patterns throughout society? The last point I want to briefly cover is the extent to which the social world is predictable, right? So, can we come up with, as social scientists, um, a reasonable estimation or a reasonable guess of human behavior, right? So, sometimes this will be referred to in the reading and other materials as social laws, right? And essentially, what this is getting at is to what extent is the world and society and people predictable? And in the reading for this week, in the first chapter, both the democratic peace hypothesis and the Rosa Parks and free riders examples demonstrate this attempt to arrive at social laws that can predict human behavior. So, the chapter for this week identifies three themes that are central to the philosophy of social sciences, or as we can now refer and think to as the study of social sciences. And those three themes are normativity, naturalism, and reductionism. I'm only going to focus on the first two, normativity and naturalism, for this lecture and throughout the course. So, normativity is a framework that references a pervasive force throughout all societies, and that's social norms. So, this is a great concept because it's something that every single one of us knows on some level, and we practice social norms throughout our day, every day. So, a simple definition for a norm is rules or expectations that guide our behavior. And these can be formal or informal. So, for example, a formal norm would be something that's a policy or a law that's written down. And an informal norm would be something that's not explicitly written out, or you don't necessarily have to think about it consciously, but you know the norm, right? And so that would be things like holding the door open for somebody. And of course, people break that norm, and then there are reactions to that, right? But that's an example of an informal norm, right? So, norm, that's to give you a sense of what uh, the term normativity is referencing, right? So, normativity is a framework that represents issues related to social norms, values, which overlap with norms, rules, and customs. And all of these words here, norms, values, rules, customs, are kind of a different way of saying the same thing, right? But they're all forces that can find their way into the practice of social science. So this can occur through the methods of a specific discipline, right? So anthropologists, especially even when you think about um, forensic anthropologists, will have discipline-specific methods that they follow, right? And if you go against that, you are breaking the norms of that discipline, right? Or the norms of those research practices. So that's one way that norms and normativity is a central theme and framework for the philosophy of social science. Another way that this can make its way into social science and the practice of social science would be a cultural value or a religious value that an individual social scientist identifies with. So, an example of this would be if somebody felt for um, religious or cultural reasons that they disagreed with the particular research subject or topic and refused to participate in it, this would be another instance of the ways that norms can make their way into the practice of social science. So those are just a few examples of how philosophers of social science will think about the role of norms in the social sciences. Naturalism, on the other hand, represents a view that the social sciences should approximate or mirror the natural sciences to a large degree, right? So this is the idea that the social sciences should be adopting and embracing the research practices of the natural sciences. And this typically is in reference to a scientific method, right? And this goes back to the last lecture with the concepts of positivism and empiricism, and the idea that systematic, standardized, objective observations are the way that we arrive at valid and justifiable knowledge, right? And so this is a view that is represented through naturalism, this framework. An essential question that would come up through this perspective is whether and to what extent do the social sciences differ from the natural sciences, right? And does that matter? Should there be separate methods for the social sciences or even specific disciplines within the social sciences because our subject matter, which is the world and society and humans and human behavior and interaction, are not comparable to studying DNA, right? Or looking at chemical compounds and how they interact with one another. All right, so moving on to another central concept that comes up in this week's reading and will be central to the rest of the work we do in this course is epistemology. So up at the top of this slide, you can see that I broke down this word. So episteme has a Greek origin and translates into knowledge. And the suffix ology, which many of you are familiar with, is the study of, right? So we can roughly translate this term into the study of knowledge. And so epistemology is rooted in philosophy, similar to many of the influences to the social sciences. And epistemologists are particularly interested in not just studying knowledge, but theorizing about knowledge, right? So developing theories and thinking about what constitutes knowledge, right? Another way to think about that is what counts as knowledge. The methods and the way that knowledge is developed, as well as the limits or the limitations of human knowledge. Right. So these are some of the things that epistemologists, in the broadest sense, are interested in. Now, I've separated the way that a philosopher versus a social scientist might approach epistemology. So, the kinds of questions that a philosopher would begin with when thinking about epistemology would be, what is knowledge, and how can we know something? Um, a social scientist, on the other hand, is going to be considering social forces, right? And this goes back to the lecture in terms of what is a social science. And part of what a social science is considering social and cultural factors that influence and shape human behavior and interaction. So I've listed out some ways, specific ways, that you can think of what a social force is or a cultural force. So politics, religion, culture, language, laws, norms, citizenship, right, or your citizenship status, your geographic location, and historical events. And I'm thinking about time period always matters when we're thinking about the way that societies change and evolve. But historical events would be more significant, large scale ones. So, for instance, a significant event in the US um, that is in the memory of many is 9/11, right? So, that's something that would be a really good example of a significant historical event that has shaped things like our politics, our laws, our norms, and our values. So this concludes the lecture on what is the philosophy of social science, and I want to highlight the case of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. Specifically, in the first chapter for this week, I want you to consider the claim the author makes about rational choice, which implies individuals having preferences among their choices, and that these preferences will determine the choice they make. And the idea that individuals are rational actors, self-interested and self-motivated. And how does that square with this example of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott? Another thing I'd like you to consider after reading the How Change Happens piece and watching the video is to consider the way that Rosa Parks' own social position, her background and experiences shaped and influenced her participation in this bus boycott.